The courtroom smelled of stale coffee and old wood, its fluorescent lights buzzing like a trapped fly. A murmur rippled through the gallery as an elderly man shuffled to the stand, his worn boots scraping the scuffed linoleum, handcuffs glinted on his wrists, his faded jacket reeking of the city's icy streets. The clerk, a wiry man with a pinched face, barked. Name. The man straightened, his posture snapping to attention despite the weight of years. Mason Quinn, he said, voice low but steady. Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Across the room, Judge Olivia Parker's breath caught. Her pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the desk with a sound that cut through the chatter. Her eyes locked on the man, wide with something between recognition and dread. The air in the courtroom thickened, every juror and spectator leaning forward, sensing the shift. Why did this name a stranger's name? Unravel a judge known for her steel. What ghost from a war-torn past was about to step into the light? Some names carry scars no one sees. Today, one would change everything. Mason Quinn stood under the courtroom's harsh lights, his weathered face a map of lines carved by time and hardship. At 69, he was a shadow of the Marine had been, broad shoulders now slumped, his once crisp uniform replaced by a threadbare jacket that smelled of dumpster alleys and winter frost. But his eyes, sharp and unyielding, burned with a pride that refused to die. A faded Marine Corps tattoo peeked from his sleeve, the eagle and anchor blurred but defiant. In his scarred hands, he clutched a crumpled letter from the VA. Its denial stamped in red ink, his only proof of a fight had long stopped waging. The courtroom was a snapshot of a struggling American city, its wooden benches packed with jurors, reporters, and curious locals bundled against the January chill. Outside, snow dusted the streets, where neon signs like the one at Lucky's Diner flickered against the gray. Mason had called those streets home for years, ever since the world forgot the man who'd carried his squad through hell in Vietnam and Iraq. He wasn't bitter. Not anymore, just tired. Tired of shelters with no beds, of VA wait lists that stretched into oblivion, of a country that saluted its heroes but left them to freeze. Case number 47B, the bailiff called, his voice flat. City versus Mason Quinn. Charges trespassing. Disturbing the peace. Mason shifted, his arthritis flaring as he faced the bench. The charges stemmed from his nights behind Lucky's Diner, where he'd huddle near the dumpster, warmed by the kitchen's exhaust vent. The diner's cook, Jimmy, slipped him sandwiches when no one was looking, a quiet nod to the bond between their families, forged when Jimmy's father served under Mason in Desert Storm. But the diner's owner, pressed by a slick condo developer hungry for a cleaner neighborhood, had filed a complaint. Now, the prosecutor sought a no trespass order that would bar Mason from the city's only shelter and soup kitchen. In the dead of winter, it was a death sentence dressed in legalese. Judge Olivia Parker presided, her presence commanding the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Mid-50s, with silver streaking her dark hair, she was known for cutting through courtroom nonsense with a mind sharper than a bayonet. Her black robe hid the weight of personal loss. A brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, killed in Iraq 2 decades ago. To the gallery, she was unflappable, her half-moon glasses perched as she scanned Mason's file, but beneath her calm, a flicker of unease stirred. The name Mason Quinn tugged at a memory, like a half-forgotten song from a warshed never fought. Mr. Quinn, Olivia began, her voice measured but probing. You've been charged with trespassing behind a Lucky's Diner. Do you have representation? Mason shook his head, his public defender stuck in another courtroom. Just me, Your Honor. She leaned forward, peering over her glasses. Would you like to make a statement? He cleared his throat, the sound rusty from disuse. No excuses. Ma'am, I was just trying to stay warm. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who'd stopped expecting mercy. Olivia's pen paused. Any reason you chose that location? Mason hesitated, his gaze flickering to the gallery, where a silver-haired man in a Marine Corps League jacket watched intently. The cook, Jimmy, Mason said, known him since he was a kid. His dad and I, we served together. He leaves food sometimes. It's not charity, just family. The word family hung in the air. a quiet defiance of the prosecutor's narrative. Olivia made a note, her expression unreadable, but her hand tightened around her pen. Something about Mason's voice, his bearing, stirred a memory of her brother's letters from Fallujah letters that mentioned a sergeant who'd risked everything. Across the room, the prosecutor, Ethan Daniels, adjusted his tailored suit, his Ivy League polish clashing with the courtroom's grit, young and hungry. He saw Mason as a stepping stone to bigger cases. "Your Honor," Daniels said, his tone clipped. "Mr. Quinn has been warned multiple times about loitering." The diner's owner filed 3 complaints this month alone. This isn't a one-off. What Daniels didn't say was that the complaints came under pressure from a developer turning the neighborhood into luxury condos. Lucky's Diner, with its chipped formica and loyal regulars, was a holdout, and Mason's presence was an easy excuse to lean on the owner. Daniels pushed for the no trespass order, knowing it would cut Mason off from the shelter on 4th Street, where cots were scarce but warm, and the soup kitchen at St. Luke's, where volunteers served meals twice a week. Olivia's gaze flicked to Daniels. "I've heard shorter closing arguments in murder trials." "Mr. Daniels," she said, her voice dry but cutting. "Make your case." The gallery murmured, a few jurors hiding smiles. Daniels flushed but pressed on, oblivious to the man he was burying, man whose scars told a story the system had long ignored. Mason stood silent, his eyes tracing the courtroom's cracked ceiling, as if searching for the young Marine he'd been. All those years, he'd carried his guilt like shrapnel, the squad mates he couldn't save, the life he couldn't rebuild. He'd never sought recognition, never begged for help. But now, standing alone, he wondered if anyone remembered his name at all. The courtroom's buzz settled into a tense hum as prosecutor Ethan Daniels stepped forward, his polished loafers clicking on the linoleum. His tailored suit gleamed under the lights, a stark contrast to Mason Quinn's faded jacket, which hung loose on his frame like a ghost of better days. Daniels flipped open a folder, his voice smooth but edged with disdain. "Your Honor, Mr. Quinn has been a persistent nuisance behind Lucky's Diner. 3 complaints this month alone prove he's disregarded warnings to vacate the premises. The city requests a no trespass order for the downtown business district." Mason's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his scarred hands folded in front of him. The no trespass order was a guillotine cutting him off from the 4th Street shelter, where cots were hard-won but warm, and St. Luke's soup kitchen, where volunteers like Mrs. Carter slipped him extra bread on Thursdays. In January's sub-zero nights, it meant more than isolation. It meant survival. Daniels didn't mention the real pressure behind the complaints: a condo developer, Pinnacle Properties, pushing to sanitize the neighborhood for high-rise buyers. Lucky's Diner, with its flickering neon and loyal regulars, was a stubborn holdout, and Mason's quiet presence by the dumpster was an easy target. Judge Olivia Parker leaned forward, her half-moon glasses catching the light. "Mr. Daniels," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel, "you've listed complaints, but I'm still waiting for evidence of harm. Did Mr. Quinn threaten anyone? Break anything?" Daniels hesitated, his confidence flickering. "No direct harm, Your Honor, but his presence disrupts the business. Customers have expressed discomfort." Discomfort. Olivia's eyebrow arched, her tone dry. "This is a diner, not a country club. Be specific." A juror stifled a chuckle, and Daniel's neck reddened. He pivoted to the arresting officer, calling, "Officer Reyes, please take the stand." Officer Maria Reyes, a rookie with a tight bun and nervous eyes, approached the witness box. Her uniform was crisp, but her hands fidgeted as she swore in. "I found Mr. Quinn behind the diner at 11:20 p.m., she said, her voice steady but soft. "He was sitting by the dumpster with a sandwich. I told him to leave, and he asked for a minute to finish eating." Olivia's pen paused. "He didn't refuse, no, ma'am," Reyes admitted, glancing at Mason. "He was polite, said the cook gave him the food. I insisted, and he stood to go, but I had to cuff him per protocol." Her eyes dropped, a shadow crossing her face. Her uncle, a Gulf War vet, had died on the streets years ago, and the memory gnawed at her. "Per protocol," Olivia repeated, her tone unreadable. Thank you, officer. As Reyes stepped down, Mason shifted, his arthritis flaring in the cold courtroom. He hadn't fought the arrest arguing with cops was a losing game, and he'd learned long ago to pick his battles, but the weight of the moment pressed on him. He'd survived firefights in Fallujah, carried men through chaos, earned a silver star he'd never bragged about. Now, he was reduced to defending a scrap of warmth by a dumpster. His eyes traced the gallery, landing on a silver-haired man in a Marine Corps League jacket, his weathered face intense, almost familiar. Mason shook off the thought, chalking it up to fatigue. Olivia turned to him, her gaze piercing. Mr. Quinn, you've heard the charges. Do you have anything to add? Mason cleared his throat through, the sound rough from years of silence. Not much to say. Your Honor, I wasn't hurting anyone. Jimmy, the cook, he's been leaving me food for years. His dad and I served together in '91. It's not begging. It's just what family does. The word family landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the courtroom. A juror, an older woman with a cross necklace, leaned forward, her eyes softening. Olivia made a note, her hands steady but her mind racing. The name Quinn echoed in her memory, tied to her brother Jack's letters, from Iraq letters she'd read until the paper wore thin. She pushed the thought aside, forcing herself to focus. Why this diner? Mr. Quinn, she asked. There are other places to find warmth. Mason's gaze dropped to his hands. The VA letter creased between his fingers. Lucky's feels like home, he said quietly. Last place I remember who I was. The simplicity of his words cut through the room's tension. Olivia's expression didn't change, but her grip on her pen tightened. She glanced at Mason's file, her eyes lingering on a line United States Marine Corps, 1975-1995. Staff Sergeant, Silver Star, Fallujah 2004. Her pulse quickened. Fallujah. The same place Jack had written from, describing a sergeant who'd saved his life. Before she could speak, Daniel stood, his voice sharp. Your Honor, Mr. Quinn's sentiments are touching, but they don't negate the law. He's been cited 3 times this year. We recommend 30 days community service and the no trespass order to ensure compliance. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. Noted, Mr. Daniels. I'll hear from the defendant further before ruling. As Mason opened his mouth to respond, the courtroom doors swung open with a creak. A man in a charcoal suit strode in, his leather briefcase gleaming. Alexander Rossi, mid-40s, carried the easy confidence of a lawyer who'd won more cases than he had lost. His firm, Rossi & Wells, ran a veterans legal clinic, a passion project born from his own father's service. He approached the bench, his voice smooth but urgent. Your Honor, Alexander Rossi for the defendant. I apologize for the delay, but I'm here to represent Mr. Quinn pro bono. Mason blinked, confusion etching his face. He hadn't called anyone couldn't afford a lawyer, let alone one who looked like he charged by the syllable. Olivia's brow furrowed. This is highly irregular. Mr. Rossi, the court wasn't informed of your involvement. It's a recent development. Rossi said, unflinched. I received a call this morning from a concerned citizen. My client deserves better than to face these charges alone. The silver-haired man in the gallery shifted, his Marine Corps jacket catching the light. Olivia's eyes flicked to him, then back to Rossi. Very well, she said. The court will take a 15-minute recess. Mr. Rossi, confer with your client. Mr. Quinn, remain in the courtroom. She rose, her robe swishing as she retreated to her chambers. The gavel's echo lingering. Mason turned to Rossi, his voice low. I don't have money for this. Don't know who you think I am. Ross's eyes softened, but his tone was firm. You're a Marine, Sergeant. That's enough. The firm's got your back. Mason frowned, unconvinced. But before he could press, the silver-haired man in the gallery stood, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Mason Quinn, he called, stepping forward. That you, Mason's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. The man's face was weathered, his Marine Corps pin glinting. But something in his stare memory of sand and gunfire stirred Mason's gut. Who's asking? Mason said. Wary. Carl Hensley, the man said, his voice thick. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, Fallujah. 4. You pulled me out of a burning Humvee, saved my life. The courtroom fell silent, every eye on Carl. Mason's breath hitched, memories of smoke and screams flooding back. He shook his head, almost imperceptible. You got the wrong guy, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Carl clutched a worn leather journal. Its pages yellowed. No mistake, he said. I've been looking for you for years. Got a letter in here from Tommy Ruishi, was there. 2. Said you took a bullet to get us out. Olivia, halfway to her chambers, paused at the door, her hand on the frame. She turned, her face unreadable, but her eyes locked on Carl. Bailiff, she said, voice steady. Ensure Mr. Hensley stays for questioning. After the recess, as the gallery buzzed, Olivia slipped into her chambers. Her composure cracking, she sank into her chair, pulling a faded photo from her desk drawer. Her brother Jack, grinning in his Marine dress uniform, his arm around her at his commissioning ceremony. Beside it lay his last letter, its ink faint from years of rereading. Sergeant Quinn saved my life today. Jack had written, ran through gunfire like it was nothing. Tell Liv I love her. Her hands trembled as she traced the words, Mason Quinn, the name she had searched for after Jack's funeral, only to hit dead-ends deployments, discharges, a system that buried its heroes in paperwork. Could this be him? The homeless man in her courtroom, fighting for a scrap of warmth, her judicial ethics screamed for recusal, but a deeper voice when tied to Jack's memory demanded she stay. If it's you, she whispered, I owe you everything. Back in the courtroom, Mason sat, his gaze distant. Carl's words had cracked something open. A memory of Fallujah, of dragging Carl and Tommy to safety, of the shrapnel that tore into his shoulder. He'd never spoken of it, never sought praise. The silver star they'd pinned on him felt like a formality, overshadowed by the men he couldn't save, like Jack Parker, killed weeks later by an IED. All these years, Mason had carried that failure, letting it sink him into the streets. Rossi leaned in, his voice low. You didn't tell me you were a hero. Sergeant, Mason's eyes hardened. Not a hero, he said, just a guy who did his job. Didn't do it well enough. Rossi studied him, then nodded. Well, my job's to make sure this courtroom sees who you are. Ready to fight for that? Mason didn't answer. But his grip on the VA letter tightened. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he thought was gone hope, or maybe just defiant. The gallery watched, the silver-haired Marine clutching his journal, and the weight of a name, Mason Quinn, grew heavier by the second. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Judge Olivia Parker as she returned from her chambers, her black robe billowing like a storm cloud. The gallery's murmurs faded, every eye fixed on her. Her face was a mask of judicial calm, but her hands, clutching a thin folder, betrayed a faint tremor. She took her seat, the gavel resting untouched, and surveyed the room. Mason Quinn at the defendant's table, his weathered face guarded, Alexander Rossi, his lawyer, poised but alert, and Carl Hensley, the silver-haired Marine in the gallery, gripping his worn journal like a lifeline. The air crackled with unspoken questions, the weight of Mason's name pressing heavier by the second. Olivia's gaze settled on Mason, her voice steady but laced with an intensity that made the jurors lean forward. Mr. Quinn, she began, your file mentions service in Fallujah, April 17th, 2004, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. Is that correct? Mason straightened, his Marine bearing flickering through his stooped frame. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice low but clear. We were escorting a supply convoy, got ambushed outside the city. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Olivia's next question came slowly, each word deliberate. During that ambush, did you pull a wounded officer to safety? A Lieutenant Jack Parker, Mason's eyes narrowed, memories clawing to the surface. His hands, scarred from shrapnel, tightened on the table's edge. Lieutenant Parker, he said, almost to himself, young guy, good officer, took a round to the leg trying to reach one of our corpsmen. His voice grew distant, the chaos of Fallujah flooding back gunfire, smoke, the weight of Jack's body as he dragged him behind a crumbled wall. I got to him, pulled him to cover. Medevac took him out. Olivia's breath caught, but her face remained composed. "What did he say to you, Mr. Quinn?" While you were pulling him to safety, Mason frowned, the question catching him off guard. He rubbed his jaw, the faint stubble rasping under his fingers. He was half out of it, bleeding bad, kept muttering about his sister. Liv, I think, said she was going to be a hotshot lawyer. Told me to tell her he was proud of her. He shook his head, a ghost of a smile fading. Thought he was delirious. Didn't know if he'd make it. The courtroom froze. Olivia's pen slipped from her hand again, its clatter echoing like a gunshot. Her eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, glistened with something raw. She removed her glasses, setting them aside with deliberate care, and leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was my brother, Jack Parker. I'm Leave." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Mason's jaw slackened, his weathered face a battleground of shock and recognition. The jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, and even Daniels, the prosecutor, shifted uncomfortably, his polished facade cracking. The revelation landed like a grenade, its shrapnel binding two strangers across 2 decades of law. Olivia's words hung in the air, intimate yet seismic, tying her to the man she had searched for since Jack's funeral, a man now standing in her courtroom, accused of a crime that paled against his sacrifice. Mason's voice broke the silence, hoarse and unsteady. "Your Honor, I didn't know. I tried to save him, but he stopped, his throat tightening. Jack's death, weeks later in an IED blast, had haunted him for years, a failure he'd carried into the streets." Olivia's eyes softened, but her voice held firm. "You didn't fail, Mr. Quinn. You gave me 2 weeks to hear his voice again, 2 weeks to know he was proud of me. That's more than I deserved." The gallery stirred, a juror wiping her eyes. But before the moment could settle, Carl Hensley stood, his Marine Corps jacket creased from gripping the bench. "Your Honor," he called, his voice rough but urgent. "There's more. Quinn didn't just save Lieutenant Parker." He held up his leather journal, its pages yellowed but meticulously kept. "I was there that day in Fallujah. He pulled me and Tommy Ruiz out of a burning Humvee, took a bullet in the shoulder doing it. The report got buried, classified mission, some Pentagon screw-up, but Tommy wrote it all down before he passed." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the bailiff's call for order barely cutting through. Olivia's gaze snapped to Carl, her mind racing. "Mr. Hensley," she said, her tone sharp but curious, "you're saying there's documented evidence of Mr. Quinn's actions beyond what's in his file?" "Yes, Mom," Carl said, stepping forward, journal in hand. "Tommy's letter in here says Quinn held off a sniper long enough for our squad to regroup, saved 3 of us, maybe more. His silver star didn't tell the half of it." Daniel stood, his voice tight. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the charges. Mr. Quinn's military service, while commendable, doesn't sit down." "Mr. Daniels," Olivia cut in, her words like a whip. "This court will decide what's relevant." Daniel sank into a seat, his face flushed. Olivia's eyes returned to Mason, who stared at the floor, uncomfortable with the sudden spotlight. The memories Carl's words unearthed were ones he'd buried deep the blood, the screams, the weight of men he'd carried, and the ones he couldn't. He'd never spoken of Fallujah, not to the VA, not to the shelters. The Silver Star, tucked away in a storage unit long since auction, had felt like a hollow gesture, overshadowed by Jack's death and the PTSD that followed. Olivia's voice softened, but her authority held. "Mr. Quinn, is what Mr. Hensley says true? Did you engage a sniper to protect your squad?" Mason's shoulders tensed, his instinct to deflect warring with the truth. "I did what I had to," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Didn't think about medals, just wanted my guys out alive." The simplicity of his words silenced the room. Carl nodded, his eyes glistening, and handed the journal to the bailiff, who passed it to Olivia. She opened it, her fingers tracing Tommy Ruiz's neat handwriting. The ink faded but legible. "Quinn was a rock," the letter read. "Took a hit, kept fighting. If not for him, he'd be in a box. Tell his family he's a hero." Olivia closed the journal, her composure fraying. She'd spent years searching for the man who'd saved Jack, only to find him here, broken by the same system that had failed her brother. But she wasn't done. During the recess, she had made a cologne that would change everything. "This court will take a brief adjournment," she announced. Rising, Mr. Quinn remained present. Bailiff, escort Mr. Hensley to the witness room for further testimony. As the gallery buzzed, Olivia retreated to her chambers, her heart pounding. She'd contacted Colonel Elena Torres, Jack's former commanding officer, now stationed at Quantico. Torres had confirmed what Carl's journal suggested: Mason's actions in Fallujah had been underreported due to a classified mission. His Silver Star, a rushed acknowledgement. New evidence, declassified last year, warranted more. Olivia's call had set something in motion, debt the Marine Corps was eager to repay. 10 minutes later, the courtroom doors opened, and a hush fell. Colonel Elena Torres entered, her uniform crisp, her chest adorned with ribbons. Behind her walked a master sergeant carrying a polished wooden case. The gallery stirred, whispers racing as Mason stood reflexively, his Marine instincts overriding his pain. Olivia took her seat, her glasses back on, but her voice carried a new weight. "For the record," she began, "I must disclose a personal connection to this case. Lieutenant Jack Parker, mentioned by the defendant, was my brother." A murmur swept the room, Mason's eyes widening. Carl leaned forward, clutching his jacket. "Oh, David, Olivia continued, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath. 20 years ago, Jack wrote to our family about a staff sergeant who saved his life in Fallujah, running through enemy fire to reach him. That man was Mason Quinn." She paused, her gaze locking on Mason. "After Jack's death, I tried to find you, Sergeant. The Marine Corps said you'd been redeployed, then discharged. I never stopped looking. And now, by some twist of fate, you're here." Mason stood motionless, his face a mask of conflicting emotions: grief, pride, disbelief. Olivia gestured to Colonel Torres, who stepped forward, her presence commanding. "Staff Sergeant Quinn," Torres said, her voice resonant, "the Marine Corps has been reviewing cases under the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative. Your actions on April 17th, 2004, were reevaluated based on declassified reports and witness accounts, including those in Mr. Rui's letter." The master sergeant opened the wooden case, revealing a Navy cross, its blue ribbon gleaming under the courtroom lights. A shocked murmur rippled through the gallery. The Navy cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, was rare, its weight undeniable. Torres continued, "For conspicuous gallantry in saving Lieutenant Parker, Corporal Hensley, and Corporal Ruiz, and for engaging enemy forces to secure a convoy route, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Mason J. Quinn." The room erupted. Carl stood, saluting sharply, tears streaming down his face. Jurors clapped, some standing, others wiping their eyes. Even Daniels rose, his earlier arrogance replaced by quiet respect. Mason's stoic facade cracked, his eyes glistening as Torres pinned the medal to his jacket. "There's no mistake, Sergeant," Torres said, her voice firm but warm. "This is long overdue." Mason's voice was barely a whisper. "Just did my job, ma'am." Olivia struck her gavel once, the sound cutting through the applause. "In light of these circumstances," she said, her voice steady but thick, "all charges against Staff Sergeant Mason Quinn are dismissed with prejudice." The gallery cheered, but Olivia wasn't finished. She descended from the bench, abandoning protocol, and stopped before Mason. Her voice softened, meant only for him. "Jack wrote something else that day," she said. "He said you told him, 'No Marine gets left behind.' Today, Sergeant, we keep that promise to you." Mason met her gaze, his shoulders straightening for the first time in years. The weight of his guilt, Jack's death, the years on the streets didn't vanish, but it lightened. Carried now by the courtroom's recognition, Carl approached, clutching his journal, and extended a hand. "You saved me, Quinn," he said. "About time someone saved you." As the applause faded, Mason stood taller, the Navy Cross a quiet beacon on his chest. For the first time in decades, he felt seen, not as a hero, but as a man whose name still mattered. The courtroom's applause faded into a soft hum. the echo of Olivia's gavel lingering like a heartbeat. Mason Quinn stood at the defendant's table, the Navy Cross pinned to his faded jacket, its blue ribbon a stark contrast to the worn fabric. His weathered face was still, but his eyes, sharp and guarded for so long, glistened with something new, not quite relief, but a crack in the armor he'd worn for decades. The gallery remained on its feet, jurors and spectators wiping their eyes, veterans like Carl Hensley saluting silently, even Ethan Daniels. The prosecutor stood, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet nod of respect. Judge Olivia Parker descended from the bench, her robe swishing as she approached Mason, protocol abandoned. She stopped before him, her voice low but clear, meant for him alone. Sergeant Quinn, she said, my brother believed in you. He said you were the kind of Marine who'd carry a man through hell and never ask for thanks. Today, we've carried you a little way back. Mason met her gaze, his shoulders straightening, the weight of years easing just enough to let him breathe. Mom, he said, his voice rough. I thought no one remembered. Not Jack, not any of it. Olivia's lips curved, a faint smile that held more gratitude than words could carry. Jack remembered. I remember. That's a start. The bailiff cleared his throat, signaling the court's return to order, but the moment lingered, a bridge built across 2 decades of loss. Olivia returned to the bench, her composure restored, though her hands still trembled slightly as she arranged her papers. This court stands adjourned, she declared, striking the gavel with finality. The charges against Mason trespassing, disturbing the peace, were gone, erased like footprints in the snow outside. As the gallery began to disperse, Daniels approached Mason, his tailored suit now seeming less like armor and more like a costume. Mr. Quinn, he said, his voice halting. I misjudged you. I'm sorry. You'll be at the shelter on 5th Street this weekend, volunteering. It's a start, like the judge said. Mason studied him, his expression unreadable. Takes guts to own a mistake. He said finally, show up. They need the hands. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many promises broken. Daniels nodded, a flicker of resolve in his eyes, and stepped away. Carl Hensley pushed through the crowd, his Marine Corps jacket creased from gripping the bench. He clapped a hand on Mason's shoulder, his voice thick. You stubborn bastard, he said, a grin breaking through. Told you it was you in Fallujah. Should have known you'd be too damn humble to admit it. Mason's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile. You're still a loudmouth. Hensley, he said, the words carrying a warmth that hadn't surfaced in years. Carl laughed, handing him the journal. Keep this, he said. Tommy'd want you to have it. Mason took the journal. It's leather-worn but solid, like the men it remembered. He didn't open it, not yet. The weight of Tommy Ruiz's words, of Carl's gratitude, was enough for now. He slipped it into his jacket, next to the Navy Cross, and turned to Alexander Rossi, who'd been watching quietly. Still don't get why you're here, Mason said, his voice low. I ain't worth all this. Ross's eyes crinkled, but his tone was firm. You're worth more than you know. Sergeant, my firm's got a veterans clinic for a reason. My dad was a Marine. 2, Carl called our hotline, said you were the real deal. We don't let men like you slip through the crack. Mason nodded, the words sinking in. For years, he'd been invisible, a shadow on the streets. Now, in a single morning, his name had become a beacon. It didn't erase the past, the PTSD, the divorce, the jobs lost to injuries, but it carved out a space for something new. Hope, maybe, or just the will to keep going. 2 weeks later, Mason stood in a small apartment, its walls bare but clean, the scent of fresh paint mingling with the chill of a snowy afternoon. The Veterans Affairs Office, spurred by Ross's legal muscle, had fast-tracked his benefits: full disability, back pay, and a 1-bedroom unit in a complex for formerly homeless veterans. The place was sparsely a couch, a table, a bed he still couldn't believe was his, but it was enough. On the wall, he'd hung the Navy Cross, its ribbon catching the light, and beside it, a framed photo of his old unit, recovered by Rossi from a storage unit. Perspective locked away for years. Jack Parker's face stared back, young and grinning, his arm around a younger Mason in Fallujah. The photo was creased, but the memory was sharp. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Mason opened it to find Olivia Parker, out of her robes, wearing a wool coat and carrying a small wooden box. Her silver-streaked hair was loose, softening her sharp features. "May I come in, Sergeant Quinn?" she asked. Her voice warm but formal. Mason stepped aside, gesturing to the small living area. "Please, ma'am. And it's just Mason now. Then I'm just Olivia," she said, a faint smile flickering. At least outside my courtroom, they sat across from each other, the awkwardness of their shared history settling between them. Olivia placed the box on the table and opened it, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are Jack's," she said softly. "He wrote to us every week from Iraq. I thought you might want to see this one." She handed Mason a letter, its paper thin from years of handling. Jack's handwriting was neat, precise, just as Mason remembered from field reports. Mason read aloud, his voice halting. "Mom, Dad, don't worry about the news. I'm safe, thanks to my NCO, Staff Sergeant Quinn. He ran through fire to get me out yesterday. Wouldn't leave me, even when I told him to. Said no Marine gets left behind on his watch." Mason Tharu's throat tightened, the words pulling him back to that day, the heat, the blood, Jack's voice fading. Olivia watched him, her eyes steady. "He wrote about you often," she said. "Said you were the kind of leader he wanted to be. After we lost him, I started a veterans court program, pushed for housing initiatives. It was because of what Jack wrote, because the system failed men like you." Mason looked away, his fingers tracing the letter's edge. "I'm no hero," he said quietly. "Just did what needed doing." Olivia leaned forward, her voice firm. "That's what heroes say, Mason. But there's something else you need to know." She paused, choosing her words. "The day Jack died, he was on a patrol to protect a civilian family, a school teacher, and her kids. He volunteered for it, said he was following your example. He didn't die because of you. He lived the way he did because of you." The words hit Mason like a physical blow, cracking open the guilt he'd carried for 20 years. He'd replayed Fallujah endlessly, wondering if saving Jack had only delayed the inevitable, if his efforts had been for nothing. Now, Olivia's words reframed it, Jack's final act. His courage traced back to him. Mason's eyes burned, but he didn't look away. "All these years," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought it didn't matter." "It mattered," Olivia said, her voice fierce. "To Jack, to Carl, to me." They sat in silence, the snow falling gently outside, blanketing the city in white. The weight of Mason's past didn't vanish, but it shifted, shared now by those who'd remembered his name. Olivia rose to leave, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jack always said the measure of a Marine is what they do when no one is watching. You lived that, even when the world looked away." Mason stood, his Marine bearing restored, the Navy Cross gleaming on the wall. "Someone remembered," he said simply. "That's more than I ever hoped." As Olivia stepped into the snow, Mason closed the door. The apartment quiet but no longer empty. Something long broken was mending, not just for him, but for all those touched by his unrecognized honor. The ripple of Mason's story spread beyond the courtroom. Carl Hensley and Jimmy, the diner's cook, launched a veterans table program at Lucky's, offering free meals and job training to homeless vets. The idea caught fire, with local churches and businesses pitching in, shamed into action by the publicity of Mason's case. Even Pinnacle Properties, the condo developer, donated, their CEO citing community values in a press release that reeked of damage control. Every Thursday, Lucky's neon glowed brighter, veterans gathering over coffee and burgers, their laughter filling the air. Jimmy visited Mason often, bringing leftovers and stories of his father, who'd always called Mason the toughest bastard in the Corps. One evening, as snow dusted the diner's windows, Jimmy grinned. "Dad would have said you still owe him a beer from '91. Mason chuckled, the sound rusty but real. "Your dad was trouble," he said, "good trouble." The veterans table grew, a small but stubborn stand against the city's indifference. It wasn't a revolution, but it was enough meals served, jobs found, names remembered. Mason didn't attend every week. Crowds still made him uneasy, but when he did, he'd sit quietly, listening to the stories, his navy cross tucked under his jacket, a silent reminder that some promises no Marine left behind could still be kept. Mason Quinn stood at his apartment window, the snow falling in soft, silent waves, blanketing the city in a hush. The glow of Lucky's Diner flickered in the distance, its neon sign a beacon through the winter night. Inside, the veterans' table was in full swing, veterans laughing over steaming coffee, their voices carrying stories of war, loss, and survival. Mason didn't always join them. The crowd still stirred the ghosts of Fallujah, the weight of memories he'd carried alone for so long. But when he did, he'd sit in the corner, the Navy Cross tucked under his jacket, listening to men and women whose names, like his, had nearly been forgotten. The apartment was quiet now, its sparse walls holding only a few anchors to his past, the Navy Cross, gleaming under a single bulb. The framed photo of his unit, Jack Parker's grin, frozen in time, and Carl Hensley's journal, open to Tommy Ruiz's letter, its words a testament to a day Mason had tried to bury. Quinn was a rock. Tommy had written, "Tell his family he's a hero." Mason wasn't sure he believed the word hero, but he was starting to believe in something else connection, the kind that pulled him back from the edge. Across town, Olivia Parker sat in her office, the courtroom empty, its echoes replaced by the soft ticking of a clock. Jack's letters lay on her desk, beside a proposal for expanding the Veterans Table program to other diners in the city. It wasn't a grand reform, not the kind that made headlines, but it was real meals served, jobs found, lives pieced back together. She traced Jack's handwriting, his words about Mason as vivid now as they'd been 20 years ago. No Marine gets left behind. He'd quoted Mason saying, Olivia had made sure that promise held, not just for Mason, but for every veteran who walked through Lucky's doors. The ripple of Mason's story had spread further than anyone expected. Carl and Jimmy, fueled by the courtroom's fire, had turned the Veterans Table into a weekly ritual, drawing veterans from across the city. Local churches donated supplies, and even Pinnacle Properties, the condo developer, had coughed up a check after their CEO faced a PR storm. The money bought a van to shuttle vets to job fairs, a small but tangible step. Jimmy, wiping down the diner's counter one night, had grinned at Mason. "Dad always said you were trouble," he'd said, his voice warm. "Guess he meant the kind that changes things." Mason had nodded, his own voice quiet. "Your dad was trouble, too. The best kind." The Veterans Table wasn't a cure for the city's homelessness still haunted the streets, and the VA's wait list hadn't vanished. But it was a spark, a reminder that names like Mason's, Carl's, or Tommy's carried weight. It was a promise kept, one meal, one story at a time. This story isn't just about Mason Quinn, though his name echoes loudest. It's about the veterans who walk among us, their scars hidden under worn jackets, their sacrifices buried in paperwork or silence. Mason's life changed because someone, Olivia, Carl, Jimmy, remembered his name, refused to let it fade. But how many others are still out there, unseen, waiting for a moment of recognition to pull them back from the cold honor? Isn't just medals pinned in courtrooms or flags folded at funerals. It's the fight to see those who've given everything, to carry them when they can't carry themselves. Mason's story shows us what's possible when we listen, when we act, when we say, no one gets left behind. His Navy Cross shines now, but it's the warmth of a diner, the grip of a friend's hand that truly brought him home. If you believe no veteran should be forgotten, drop respect in the comments below. Share this story to remind others that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear faded jackets, carrying scars we can't see. And if you want to make a difference, check out organizations like Veterans of Foreign Wars or Wounded Warrior Project. They're out there, fighting for men and women like Mason, ensuring their names are heard. As I pieced this story together, I kept coming back to one thing: Mason didn't need a medal to be a hero. He needed someone to look him in the eye and say, "You matter." That's what stuck with me. What I hope sticks with you. We pass veterans every day on street corners, in diners, in our own families. Their stories are waiting, not for glory, but for us to listen. So let's look closer, reach out, and keep their names alive. Because when we do, we're not just saving them, we're saving the best parts of ourselves.